Good morning and welcome. On behalf of Lamar Associates Indian Country Training, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on problem-oriented policing, putting partnerships to work, provided by grant number 2014-HW-WXK056, awarded by the Office of Community Policing Services, U.S. Department of Justice. Let me start off first by introducing myself. I'm Cindy Davis, Indian Country's Training Chief Executive Officer. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few features of this platform to aid you in getting the full benefit of this webinar. At this time, please direct your attention to the text bar to the left of your screen. Should you have a question during the webinar, type your question at any time and send it to all presenters. Your questions will be answered in the order of which they are received. If we don't get to your question, we will during the 15-minute question and answer following the presentation. Technical difficulties. Technology is great when it works. If you experience technical issues and suffer a failure of connection, try calling in on your phone, but don't worry. A recorded version will be sent out post-webinar. If we lose the webinar altogether, we will reschedule. Immediately following the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey and the technical assistance site. There, you will find free online courses and resources to view. We kindly ask that you take a minute to complete this survey, as your comments and feedback allow us to accurately report back to the COPS office. And please note, we will email you a link to view and share the video presentation of this webinar. If there are multiple viewers participating today, please email the names and titles to info@lamarassociates.net. We thank you for that. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ronald Glensor, or as we call him, Ron. He's a retired Assistant Chief of Police with 35 years in a large metropolitan police department, also known as Reno, has trained over 500 departments throughout the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and currently the Ukraine. He is the author of Hope and Harmony. We have worked with Ron for the past 5 years, offering training in Indian Country on community-oriented policing, methamphetamine, drug, and endangered children. At this time, I'd like to welcome Ron to join us. Morning, Ron.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. This is a very, I hope you find it very interesting. It's certainly one of my favorite topics to talk about. Cindy, did you want to go over the questions first again, or no?
No, I'm just going to pop the screen up while you get going, and then I'm going to log out and get your next slide going.
Great, thank you. As Cindy said, we're going to talk about problem solving today, but we aren't going to talk about problem solving necessarily in the context of policing only. It's something that police do in the natural course of their business, but it's something that communities do better and best when they work collaboratively. So that is going to be the context of our discussions today. How basically do communities work together using a proven problem-solving model? I apologize for that little, for the light on my face, if that's bothering anybody. How do they use a problem-solving model that's been proven since the 1980s to resolve neighborhood issues? Those problems that are most persistent in your communities, that cost the most resources and also cost the most fear and most danger. And so that is the context of problem solving that we will be discussing today. Now, as the seminar goes on, we have a lot to discuss in a short hour and a half, and I've divided it up to give us some time basically to interact. So I would ask for you, please don't be shy. I'm going to ask some questions as we move along and ask that you share some of your thoughts, experiences, and ideas about your community as we talk about the different issues related to problem solving. So that's how it's going to go today. If you are shy, I'll be sure and to keep the discussions going for all of us. So what is this idea of problem solving? Well, Herman Goldstein has been around since the 1950s. He actually was started as an academic in law school at the University of Wisconsin. He's written a lot about communities and police, and what are the best relationships that help to fix issues that elicit fear, that elicit crime issues, and how we can work together to do those better. And he understood a few concepts about how police work in the context of communities that helps us understand really what they do best and what their limitations are. For example, he shared with us an idea called incident-driven policing. And what he said basically was that police, when they go to a call, they don't often think about what is this call's relationship to other calls. How many times have we been here? Is this a problem that occupies most of our time? In most cases, police respond to the problem simply by a couple of ways. One is that they may warn the people to say, "Hey, stop what you're doing," in the case of a party or loud music. It may be more serious, and they issue a citation. It may be that the people are calling to ask about, to complain about a burglary problem, and so they would write a report. And in the most severe of incidences, they make an arrest. But as Herman noted, he said, what's missing is that identification of clusters of related incidents and problems that we're going to talk about a lot today. What's missing is any analysis of what really is the problem here. Is the problem homelessness, or are there conditions that we can deal with that will reduce homelessness? Is the problem really inebriance in a park in your community? Or is it that we are missing the underlying conditions that contribute to people being drunk, people being without jobs, people being without assistance? And can we address those and address that problem? He also helps us understand that there's a number of ways in which police are capable of responding to problems that they haven't in the past, and that there are different actors that participate on a willing or unwilling basis and impact problems in the ways that we can understand them better. For example, police typically focus on the offenders mostly, even though they deal with victims. There's a lot of us to understand, a lot that we can understand about the victims. There's a lot that we can understand about the places where problems occur. And so he shared that with us. And then he also talked about, how do you know if you're going to spend your community's resources, your public's time and effort on an issue, that you were successful? What can you learn about assessments, about ways in which you can analyze your problem to understand better how to evaluate your efforts? Because that saves us time and effort. That gives us that satisfaction and feeling that what we did was correct and worthwhile, and we could replicate it and do it again with other types of problems. Well, in the early experimentation of problem solving, led by the works of Herman Goldstein in Madison, Wisconsin, they found that police and communities were able to work together and resolve a number of very serious issues. In the case of Madison, it was problems with prostitution, it was problems with robberies, it was problems with burglaries of vehicles in their very high industrial area, their shipping industrial area, where there are tens of thousands of cars in the shipping industry and burglaries occurring. And that was one of the first experimentations. Now, my work in problem solving over the years from the 1980s began actually in Indian country. It began in a project that I worked with the National Crime Prevention Council, the McGruff dog, basically what most people know about NCPC. And they were doing work called that was going into 5 or 6 different agencies, working with them, the tribal organizations, working with them to resolve problems in their community. The outcome of that was a publication called Hope and Harmony. They shared the experiences. So it was actually the works in Indian country in the 1980s that really launched problem solving, problem-oriented policing, along with the early experiments in Madison, Wisconsin, that is now a standard in how communities and how police should and do in many cases work together. So that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's move along and see what else we can know. So the first question becomes always, is this something that I'm going to learn today that we're going to apply to every single type of problem in our community? No, it's not. What we're going to focus on today are those persistent problems. And I'm going to talk about that in a number of different contexts. But for a definition, and we'll pick this definition apart, what a problem is that you should spend time and additional resources and collaborative efforts working on is something that meets this definition. It's two or more incidents that are similar in nature, that in one way or more cause community harm and are a concern to the police and the public. And so what kind of problems are these? Well, we can identify them as order maintenance problems. Much of what I've learned in 35 years of policing that neighborhoods complain more about than anything else is yard cars, is parking problems, is speeding problems, is rowdy juvenile problems, is gang graffiti. It's those types of things. It's the intrinsic things that we fear, we get a feeling of uncomfort about, that if it was cleaned up, if it was taken care of, that people would feel much safer. And that falls under an idea called broken windows theory, which simply says that if you clean up your neighborhoods, if you fix the broken windows, more broken windows aren't likely to occur, and you're able to deal with those problems better, solve those problems, and reduce the harms and the fears and the crime that occurs in a neighborhood. There's another important part of understanding a problem that falls under the heading of crime prevention. Now, this is the second of several seminars that we'll be doing. The next one that we'll be doing is all about crime prevention. I'm going to give you a teaser in this class today about what crime prevention really is. Many of us understand crime prevention as programs, and I'll talk about that. But crime prevention is much more complex than that. It falls under the heading of environmental characteristics. How does lighting, does building design, does neighborhood design, do bushes, do the construction of parks, can all that contribute to more crime than less crime? And it can. And if you understand the simple aspects and ideas about environmental crime prevention, we can make our communities safer. We can make our communities safer not only in our neighborhoods where we live, but also for our children that go to parks, our children in their schools. And so there's some very simple concepts. There are also some ideas in crime prevention called situational crime prevention. What can we do to make it more difficult for offenders to commit crimes? It's very simple ideas that don't cost communities a lot of money, that can resolve a lot of crime issues. And we're also going to talk about how communities become at risk. Some problems are very narrow to very small locations in neighborhoods. It could be a corner. It could be one house selling drugs in a neighborhood. It could be a larger area of a community. It could be an entire apartment complex or housing or Indian housing. It could be your entire reservation. It could span several states, as you know, in terms of your reservations that cross state yours. So it can be very complex in that respect. Today, we're going to focus primarily, though, on those neighborhood issues, where you live and the things that you can get your arms around and deal with. And I'm going to ask and share with you and ask you to share with me some of your ideas and thoughts as we move along. There's another very simple idea about problem solving and how it affects neighborhoods that help us to understand really why it's important that we look at these things. And it's called CHEERS. It's a very easy acronym to understand, but it's something not to cheer about. So what does it mean? It means that if our communities have persistent problems, as you see the officer there picking a bottle of liquor out of a car. And if drunk driving is a problem in your community that's causing a lot of injuries, a lot of accidents, a lot of people end up in court, it costs the community, it costs the families when they're in jail. So what are the impacts? Why is this so important? It's because the community at large is affected. When a person's continually arrested or several people are arrested for drunk driving, it's just not a problem that they and their families deal with. We all deal with it, because of the damages that it causes, because of how much money it costs our community to deal with these types of problems. A person is now out of work. A family is now out without a father or a mother or a loved one. It causes harm to the community if it's crashing and causing damage, or in the worst case scenario, if somebody's life is taken. Expectations of police are reasonable. In this case, what are the expectations? What should police be doing? Just making arrests? Is that the most effective way? Well, in some cases like domestic violence and drunk driving, arrests are required or necessary in many communities by law. But in some cases, these problems with juveniles, with gangs, with graffiti can be dealt with in a much better way in courts, in juvenile court, in courts designed to deal with specific juvenile problems. Events are discrete and discernible. Sometimes it's not clear what the problems are. And so it takes some understanding of the problem that we're going to learn about in this process. Problems are recurring. Problems cluster. I'm going to talk about how problems cluster by 3 ways. One, by offenders, another way by location, and another way by victims, and why we need to pay attention to all 3. And also that there are similarities oftentimes among different types of events. And so how do we understand that? And so that is the acronym CHEERS, and why it is so important that we understand what we are getting into the beginning so we can start picking it apart. So let's do that. Let's start looking at the different ways in which problems cluster and for our understanding. So one way is by behaviors. So what are the behaviors we often see in communities? Well, in my community in Reno, Nevada, we had a very large homelessness problem. And it was tied to a number of factors. We had one of them, what they called Taj Mahal homeless centers, that was very comfortable and had plenty of beds to help people that are legitimately homeless. We also have a lot of casinos like Las Vegas. So there's lots of food, there's lots of alcohol, there's lots of places that can support a person. So panhandling in my community was a problem. In other communities, the problems by behavior may be armed robberies. It may be assaults because there's a lot of bars. In my community, again, we have a university. We have a lot of bars around the university. We have a lot of bars also in the public housing and port areas. And those bars lead to a lot of assaults and a lot of problems. We have speeding problems. We have, like all communities, drug dealing problems. So let me ask you to share, if you could, and send in and quickly respond, for those of you that can, what kind of problems that are behavior related do you see in your communities? What kind of problems are plaguing your communities do you think are most important that you should be dealing with? Anybody? Are you all shy? Oh, here we go. Thank you, Rachel. Domestic violence. Teresa and Rachel say domestic violence. Yes, domestic violence is a problem in every community. And we're going to talk about some ways, some unique ways in which domestic violence can be dealt with better. Thanks, Russ. Prescription drug abuse. Probably America's biggest problem. We've done a lot of training, Lamar and Associates, with prescription drug abuse. Prescription drug abuse and emergency entries have surpassed all other drugs now combined. So it is the biggest problem in America, also causing the most deaths. Teresa, suicide, very sad issue. And we've seen an increase related a lot to drugs with juveniles, especially during the high days of methamphetamine. And Ellen talks about car thefts. A big problem, especially that we see among border states. Border states along the south where you can't keep a car sometimes that go across the border. So very good, everybody. Thank you. So let's go on to the next one, and please keep chiming in. So it could also be about persons. So what are the persons' problems? Well, they could be gangs. They could be mentally ill. They could be mental illness, chronic inebriants, repeat victims. We'll talk about that, and repeat offenders. So you see, these aren't all problems that what's unique as we start looking into how problems congregate and how they repeat themselves. Not all these are problems that are the people's fault necessarily. They are problems where we need to take a helping hand, not just deal with them in an enforcement way. And so mental illness is a problem that people can't help, that is very, very complex. Chronic inebriance is related oftentimes to mental illness and drug abuse. And so it's very complex. Repeat victims. Well, I'll talk a little bit later on about how people are repeatedly victimized for some reason, for a number of reasons that we'll share. Repeat offenders is a problem that we will talk about, and gangs is another. So if you were to look at persons related problems in your communities, share with us again, what kind of persons problems do you see in your communities that are probably costing you the most time and most effort that you'd like to, at the end of this class, think about dealing with? Child custody and domestic violence. Boy, that's a tough one, Jared. I remember when I was a young sergeant working the desk at the police station, we would literally have parents come into the station with holding the arm of a child and pulling the arms this way, and each of them in their other hand had a court order saying that they had custody of the child. Very difficult and complex problems, but one that can be dealt with better when looking at it under a problem-solving model. So very good one. Border jumpers. Very good, Michelle. I mean, it's here we have the presidential elections coming up. Immigration is going to be one of the biggest issues that both sides are going to beat each other up with not dealing with effectively. This is not the first election that it's been an issue, and probably won't be the last time that it'll be an issue, only because I was the policy leader for the president's commission on law enforcement in the future. And my committee was the one that dealt with immigration. And we just simply don't have an immigration policy, so it's not going to go away. And so how do we deal with border jumpers? How do we deal with people that are already in the country? How do we deal with, with 5 decades of people that have come into our country and now has established families here? What is it? It's not as easy as saying necessarily that we're going to build a fence or we're going to send everybody back and they can work their way back in. It's more complex than that. And so how do we deal with that? So as you all know, because many of your communities at large deal with very different and sometimes multiple states and multiple issues, and many of them are along the border. I've worked in training in all the reservations along the southern border, especially, and in the northern border in some cases, in the northern states. But in the southern border, it's far more complex. So how do we deal with those? How do we identify what those big problems, those repeat problems are there, and deal with them more effectively? So very good. So we also have location. I mean, everybody, it doesn't take a police officer to know the places in your community where the problems are, right? The bars, the intersections, the neighborhoods, maybe the house or the apartment complex. So tell me, what are the location problems in your communities, in your neighborhoods that there's going to be a problem? And for the police officers in the class, or the people in justice, you all know as well. There's not a police officer I know that I can't ask before shift, tell me today, is there a location that you're going to be at? A house, a park, a school, where all takes up all your time? And if there is, let's talk about how we can reduce those calls by dealing with the problem more effectively. So where are those places in your community, those location places that are at issue? Sorry, everybody. I'm having tea because my throat is just killing me today. Oh, storefronts. Good. Grocery stores. Is it because there's drug dealing going on, or other types of issues going on, Teresa, that's causing for problems there? I remember, panhandlers. Okay, very good. Casinos, yes. Rachel, I feel your pain. I would always tell people, and when we do meth training in Indian country, we talk about, it's a joke, but it's sad because it's true. I say, if you've never seen a tweaker or you want to know where your tweakers are, go to a casino at 12 o'clock at night. They're all there. And the sad thing is that they are, for a lot of reasons what the causes of methamphetamine were. My community had young kids in high school going to the 7-Elevens and basically taking over on Friday and Saturday nights after football games. They're drinking in the park. They're causing all kinds of problems. In the early days, what we suggested, and some of you will think this is funny, but it worked very well, is nothing worked. Warning them, working with parents, everything else, nothing worked. What worked best? They put loudspeakers on the outside and played classical music. How funny. And the kids left. They said, I can't deal with this. It was like kryptonite to them, and so they left. And so it was just a simple way of getting them to move along and changing their environment. And Frank is saying that they have jurisdiction problems with law enforcement agencies, which cause many problems. Yes, a big problem. And I have never seen so many jurisdictional problems that are more complex around the world than what I find in the United States and Indian country, where you literally may have 10 different law enforcement agencies, that you have direct law enforcement functions in Indian country, or you have an MOU in order to use services or be in their jurisdictions. Very, very complex. And sometimes I've seen MOUs signed, and basically you don't get the services that you're signing for, that you're asking for, because the first thing that happens is that whenever there's a problem, the primary agency pulls all their people out for their own purposes, and that's wrong. And so how do you deal with that? So very good, Frank. You help us to understand what the complex problems are from a law enforcement perspective. And I'm sure that that's in other services, especially in the social services in Indian country, as we've seen it, in the education services, in those types of places. So what else do we have? We have problems that are here by time. We know at bar closing that there's a rise in certain problems with drunks wandering out of places. We know that there's certain times of years when there's big festivals, that there's rush hour traffic, people getting to and from where they live. And they all have different types of persistent problems. In rush hour, it's traffic related. At annual festivals, it may be theft problems, it may be drunk problems, it may be fighting problems. At bar closing hours, it may be DUIs, it may be domestic violence, it may be fights at the end of the bar as people go mano a mano to defend their false sense of bravado or pride while they're drinking in the bar. So it may be all those things. So what other types of time problems do you all see in your communities that may contribute to our potpourri, so to speak, of different types of problems that we address? Tribal fairs and powwows, exactly. Dealing with 10 police agencies, as Michelle said again, is huge for the problem before. That's amazing, Michelle. I mean, that is like what I call herding cats. So let's look at the last one. And this last one is called hybrid problems. So the problems that don't really fit into any one of these, like prescription drug abuse and dealing, by and to students in Bureau of Indian, in BIE, in the Bureau of Indian of Education at high schools during school hours. And so these are hybrid type problems. Are there any other problems that we haven't met that really don't fit in, that you see in your communities, that we might talk about as hybrid problems? I mean, this is a great one for prescription drug abuse. We know that in parts of Oklahoma where cheese heroin is sold for $5 a bundle to students, that they simply fold in a very unique kind of way and into their and put in their books where you can't see them. The toxicity of some of that drugs ranges from 50% to 100%. We've seen a number of overdoses by young people on very cheap cheese heroin. So nothing? Okay, well let's move. Oh, here we go. Tribal fairs powwows against elders using predators against elders using technology. Yes, it's very good. We could spend a whole class on the dangers of technology and cybercrime and how our poor elders are just being preyed upon because they don't know. They don't know the technology. They feel the technology is safe, and it's not. And for children as well, there's some amazing research out there that shows what the real dangers are of technology that we don't think as parents oftentimes it may be. So those are how problems congregate together. And we'll talk more about patterns of problems here in just a moment. But we must understand as well that problems vary by their scope, by how big they are. Most problems are neighborhood related. That it is based on an area of a few houses or a larger neighborhood. But it can be that one crack house. And we have to ask ourselves, what are all the problems that relate to a single house selling dope in a neighborhood and uncontested, meaning that nothing's being done? Well, we know that it causes traffic problems. It could be infighting between gangs and gang-related problems. It could be related to drug-endangered children inside the house because of drug sellers and drug users. It could relate to violence outside or with the people inside the house because they aren't paying their second-tier drug dealer all the money that they owe them. And it could be just on and on and on and on, a number of different problems related to that single house. But problems could also be an entire reservation, a citywide, as we might refer to it as a citywide problem. Or it might be even your reservation across multiple states, which I would call a district-wide problem. And is all you know that there are some jurisdictions that have 5 different counties or states that they cross. And so how do you, Teresa, was mentioned earlier by Frank, how do you do that? How do you deal with that issue when maybe you have more or less support or engagement of people in dealing with it? So the scope of the problem matters and how you can deal with it. But most of what we'll talk about today are those neighborhood problems that you can get your arms around as a community and deal with better using the process. So here's some common problems that in my experience that we know from the research that really impacts Indian country more than anything else. And that is burglaries, thefts, drugs, drug-endangered children, many of these that we've already talked about, spousal abuse, gangs, truancy, juvenile delinquency, drunk driving, gambling addiction, which has all kinds of tentacles that cause for problems related to other things that might be drug-related, alcohol-related, and things like that. So what else? What else do you see as prevalent problems that are not on this list that based on problems that are persistent that we might see in Indian country, or you might have specific to the unique aspects of your community? And we've already seen, it sounds like to me that some of your communities are border communities, that some of your communities have multiple jurisdictions. So what are some of the other issues that relate to that here? Thanks, Jared. So adult children are still living off their parents. Boy, is that a problem. Let me tell you, it's not a problem only in the United States. There is a term that's used in Japan, actually, for their young people. Now, Japan is a society that respects its elders and that takes care of its elders, not unlike Indian country. I mean, there's an expectation for respect of your elders. There's an expectation that in their older years that a family will take care of their elders. Well, what Japan is finding is that 20-somethings and 30-somethings that are involved in gaming has gone to a psychotic end, that's my own terms, where these kids, these young adults, are locking themselves in rooms for up to 30 days at a time, basically expecting their mothers to bring them meals as they're involved in this worldwide gaming with other people, playing games on the computer, completely against their society's morals, number one, and also what they see as being important. Lifelong job, getting married before you're 26, and a lot of these other things. It's throwing Japan and their culture, it's pulling it inside out, and they don't know what to do to deal with it. So it's a huge problem there. Child abuse and neglect, trafficking. And trafficking takes a lot of different aspects. One is trafficking relates to human trafficking, drug trafficking, and also drug endangered children, because it's related strongly nowadays because of every phone has powerful social networking capabilities. Trafficking is related to juvenile trafficking and prostitution, and the selling of that prostitution, even with simple iPhones. Dependent on government assistance, big in many communities. In some of our biggest cities in the United States, we see that there's 5 generations of welfare in Detroit, in Chicago, in some of the poorer cities, and we see that, as you know, in some reservations and some Indian communities. Generalization, different generations of drug and alcohol abuse. Sorry, my tongue and my lips didn't work. True. And things seem to repeat themselves. I mean, I'm a product of the 1960s, where heroin came basically from generations of people that were in the service during that time, and I was in the Marine Corps, and a lot of people got addicted to heroin in Far Eastern countries while they were serving our country, and came back to the United States. Heroin was only 1.5% to 3% then. Heroin's come back. It's 90 to 100% in some communities now. Marijuana has taken very different. Now it's legal in many states, or at least it's for the medicinal purposes in even more states. And so things come back. We see that. We saw a resurgence of LSD across Indian country in the last 5 years, and a number of other drugs. So it is a very difficult thing to continue to keep track of and to deal with. So that's the problems that we see. So how do we deal with these problems? Well, there's a simple process that was developed called SARA. And the SARA process simply teaches communities how to scan the problem, analyze the problem, assess the problem, and respond to the problem. The SARA problem-solving process is a simple design that helps you think through a problem so that you understand that this is one we're going to need to spend some time on. And this is the problem-solving process that was used in the early days in the 1980s when policing in Newport News first started using it. And policing and communities in Indian country began using it in Hope and Harmony. And it is a process now that has been adopted and used around the world in places like China, in Israel, across Canada, across Europe, across the southern Asian rim, and even in countries like South America. And this is how communities are being trained to identify those persistent problems and find ways to respond to them with more success. So what is this process? Let's look at it and pick it apart. Well, for some of you will remember this gentleman, Steve Juneau, who was a member and lead for training for Walt Lamar and Associates for many, many years. He is now back working with other organizations doing the same types of training. He is now with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. And Steve is an expert in this area and continuing to do lots and lots of training. So what does scanning do for us? Well, remember the definition of what is a problem that I gave you earlier? This is the first question that would be asked. Now, what do I mean by asked of who? Well, our last training seminar that we did was about how communities form coalitions, how communities under community policing get together to deal with problems. So this is the process now, problem solving, that they use. And this is the process that you as a community say that, boy, this problem is really persistent and we need to sit down and form a committee or form a coalition or form a group of a cross section of our community to deal with this. So we're going to use the SARA process. And so as Steve says, at the first step, your challenge is to identify those patterns by people, by victims, by all those things that we talked about earlier. And so that's what scanning does. Those crimes or issues that deplete your community's resources. For example, it doesn't have to be things like robberies, and typically it's not. Remember, I told you that most problems deal with those really mundane types of things. There was an area of my community that was very remote, and it was mostly trailers. And the officers there spent most of their times dealing with dog barking problems. Now that would sound funny to most of you maybe, but maybe not. There were 109 barking dog problems in that community in a small area, a neighborhood, in 2 weeks. Now, how many resources, community resources, based on the complaints of that community, do you think were called upon to deal with those complaints? Well, there was police, there was animal control, there was calls to the community leaders, there were complaints to everybody in the council, there were threats of lawsuits, there were complaints against police, there were complaints against everybody. And how much money was spent dealing with it? Well, I can tell you on the police side that every time a police officer goes to a call, it takes about 45 minutes. So the math of 109 calls times 45 minutes, and that police officer is now located for all that time in a very remote area of their city or their county and not available for emergency calls in other areas or quicker response. So that kind of brings us to more clarity about what the risks are if we don't deal with these problems. And really, is it fair? Is it fair to the people that have to continue to complain because something like an animal barking can't be dealt with efficiently? And there's lots and lots of those kinds of problems that we're going to talk about. So how do we scan for problems? Well, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, it may be a citizen talking to a police officer saying, hey, look over there. This is a problem. Or it may be because a community has taken it upon themselves to do a walk. To say, look, we're fed up with this problem and we want a grassroots effort to deal with it. Or it may be a council, a leadership saying, look, these are the complaints that we get that we want your police department to work on. It may be a survey. It may be a tip line that's anonymous so people can call in. And we know that oftentimes happens with drug problems so that people don't have to get announced. It may be your newspaper. It could be an online blog. It could be from tweeting. It could be from more complicated crime analysis that identifies, that police do to identify it. It may be public meetings. It could be all those things. And as George says, the most obvious challenge is tribal governments tasked to provide jobs with meaningful income. It is. It is. You see a lot of cities now talking about it's not to provide an income to survive, but it is our responsibility to provide an income that is livable. And what is a livable income? So people can be productive. And so what does that mean? What are all the other attachments to that? So in scanning problems, there are many, many different resources. And you can see here, the point that I want to make is, how many of those research are police related? Well, crime analysis is. What a citizen calling the police is. But what are all these? These are the actions, and sometimes independent actions, of community members, of local business, of your community leaders, of your journalists, of community meetings, and a host of different, it may be at powwows, it may be at crime prevention efforts, it may be all those things. So it's important that we understand that police are one cog in a wheel, a big wheel of the community that can come forward and deal with things more effectively and efficiently. So what it also helps us to do, and what you see here is a police officer talking to a community, is it helps us to take a more microscopic examination in analyzing problems. So let me go back real quickly. If that problem of analysis was successful, and it now, by doing all this, and let me skip back, that you can say these incidents are similar in nature, causing harm and a concern to both police and public. If that's what you can say in the affirmative, then you can move on to analysis. Now, let's say it's not. Let's say that what you find out in getting together as a group and going through the scanning process and asking yourselves these questions and looking at the information, you say, well, this is just a problem that the school can handle. Yeah, there's a lot of things happening, but really, this is something the school can handle. They're readily available to handle that. We don't need to get business involved, leadership involved, anything else. So there's no sense in having lunch every month and sitting down and seeing what we can do as a larger community. We're all busy. And that's the beauty of this process, because I know many of you, like I did for a living as the assistant police chief, went to lunch after lunch after lunch after lunch. I think that all the chicken came from the same chicken. I think that all the bad food came from the same place. And I oftentimes, sadly, found that after a year long of meetings, not much was done because they weren't organized in a way that we talked about meetings needing to be organized in our last webinar. So it helps us to come to that point and decide that we don't need this. We can just move on quickly. But say it is a problem that needs that, and we need to do analysis. So now we need to look deeper. So what does that mean? Many of you have seen the movie, and let me ask just quickly, say, yes, I've seen it or not, have seen this movie. Can anybody tell me what the movie is? I'm dating some of you, I know. Apollo 13. Great, Rachel. Thank you. There is a scene in Apollo 13 that I love to use in our trainings on problem solving. And what it basically does is, what happens is that at a point in the flight of Apollo 13, the commander, Jim Lovell, says, Houston, the famous term, Houston, we've got a problem. And they did. Now, what was the on-ground space control's reaction? Their hair didn't go on fire. They didn't say, oh my gosh, this is a crisis. We're all going to die, and they're going to die, and there's no fixing it. No. They did what I'm saying the problem-solving process in communities can do very well when they understand scanning and analysis. So does anybody remember after the ground leader said, okay, I understand there's a problem. Let's work on the problem. Let's not make it worse by guessing, which without analysis is oftentimes what we're doing when we respond to problems, when we respond to gang problems, when we respond to all those problems you listed, the car problems on the border of auto theft, the domestic violence problems. We also knee-jerk and say, we got to do something. So let's do something first before we think about it and analyze it. And oftentimes we fail or we only have limited success. So what happened in this movie? Yes, George, we meet and think about the community's readiness to change. For example, are they in denial and apathy? Or at the point to have meaningful, respectful discussion in terms of responsible civic engagement. Perfect. Perfect, George. And Jolie. Hi, Jolie. How are you doing? Good to see you. Jolie is one of the best trainers I've ever worked with in Indian country. And it's good to see him here. So, so what happens in the next scene? What do they do that really identifies probably what we're going to talk about analysis better than anything? Does anyone remember? Yes, perfect, Rachel. They did this. They laid out, as Rachel says, what Houston did was they laid out a huge table, and they got all the engineers together that built Apollo 13, and they laid out on the table everything that those astronauts inside the space shuttle had available to them to solve the problem. So they had pieces of everything in there that they could pull apart, take apart, and use to fix the problem with the craft. And with that, the engineers went to work. They said, we've got a leak problem. How do we fix it with what they have available? These are their Band-Aids because we have to get them home safely. And they figured it out. And they told the commander and their staff, take these pieces apart, put them together, put them here, and you will fix this problem. And they brought them safely home to Earth. Well, you know what? We can use that same idea in a group meeting to deal with domestic violence. And here's how it works. You have now identified that domestic violence is the problem that you want to work with in your community. And in doing your scanning in your first meetings, you have decided this is a persistent problem that we need to fix. And now you're starting to analyze it. And one of the first things you're going to do in community development is ask yourselves, who do we need sitting at the table? And there's a process we talked about in the last webinar that is available to you to look at in that webinar, in that training, that you bring all the right people to the table. And the next question you're going to ask everybody at your first meeting is, what do you have to bring to the table? Like in the Houston case, tell us all the resources, all the ideas, the funding, the innovative things that you've done to deal with this problem well. And then everybody, after laying their things out on the table, we're going to move from that to analysis, through analysis, and then on to responses. So how does that work? Well, analysis, understanding now that we've got everything out on the table, and now we've got a group of people, the right people there, it confirms the problem's real. It confirms what the problem appears to be, or you can redefine the problem. It helps us to understand why it's happening. That criminological question. Why is this happening? Are people drunk because people are just drunk, or are there contributing factors? Are people driving cars drunk just because they're drunk and driving cars? Or are there reasons and places that contribute to that happening? In Reno's case, we found that inebriates in the parks, drunks in the parks, that led to a lot of violence between drunken people in the parks, a lot of intimidation and pandering of people walking in and out of the parks, wanting to use the parks, a lot of complaints about mothers not being able to use the parks because of being accosted and offended and things of that nature, using the parks as an open bathroom. Why is that? Is it just because people are sleeping in the parks and they're drunk? We found that the biggest contribution was because all the liquor stores in close proximity to the parks were selling liquor in a way that was easily transportable and cheap and easy to afford. The little bottles that you see on the airlines that are sold in casino communities, and the cheapest alcohol and the cheapest wine. And so the casinos and the business community and the city got together and say, what can we do to change this? And by changing that one factor, along with a number of other issues, getting resources to the inebriants to get help for their drunkenness and get them out of the parks, between that, reduced and turned the parks back over to citizens. That's those underlying causes that I talked about in the problem-solving process, where by having a whole group of community members there together, you can come up with that. Police can only come up with a few, but then you find business can come up with a lot. The city can come up with some ideas, as can citizens that want to volunteer and deal with it. And so, what else is in that analyzing process that can help us? Well, in this case, you see discovering a new, more effective strategy that the Saginaw Chippewa Chief Steve Pago signs a war on drugs decree. And what do you see in there with it? And I love this photo because it shows young people. And young people, when you're talking about social issues, are often ignored, but when we use them, they turn out to be our most powerful asset in prevention. So what else do we know about the analysis? Well, there's a thing called the problem analysis triangle. And now I'm going to give you in 3 minutes an entire class on criminology. For bad things to happen, you need 3 factors. So let's say the problem is gang graffiti. Okay, so this problem is gang graffiti, and it's a persistent problem. It meets the definition of problem solving. It's 2 or more incidents in a community, it's creating harm, and it's an issue that's related to police, that police are concerned about and that the public's concerned about. So what's needed for graffiti to occur? Well, any persistent problem requires an offender or offenders, in this place, gangs, and it may be multiple gangs or one gang. It needs place or places, and graffiti is usually places to occur. And it needs victims or targets. Well, what are the victims of graffiti? Graffiti, well, it's fences, it's walls, it's businesses, it's bridges, it's every place that graffiti can go. Now, why do I say this is criminology? Because there's a criminological a theory called routine activities theory that says very simply, for bad things to happen, you need an offender and a victim to come together at a place for bad things to happen. So the question becomes, well, how do you stop these things from happening? Well, you have to have an impact on the place. In graffiti, you need to paint over the graffiti because it reduces territorialism. And we know that removing graffiti in 24 hours or less has a huge impact on people's fear of graffiti and complaints and territoriality of gangs. Or you can have an impact on the offenders, on the gangs, in 2 ways. From an enforcement perspective, by catching the offenders, but that's difficult to do. Or you can give them another outlet, a creative outlet. In St. Paul, Minnesota, where they had Hispanic gang in communities that were just devastating the business community. What they did was that they contracted those gangs to do cultural murals on their bridges, on their walls, around their businesses in the communities. And once they made it cultural, once they made it personal, once they made it prideful, they saw a significant reduction in gang graffiti in their community. Or you could target, address with the target. Well, how do you do that? Well, in some communities, it's simply by putting paint on certain type of paint so that it's easy to scrub off, or by removing, or by only selling paint to 18 years old or older, or not letting, not selling the paint tips with the paint. Now, that used to be easier in the old days. Today, it's such an art that people that do graffiti are such artists that they typically get their paint tips online because they become their paint brush. And so it's harder to do. But there's a lot of things that can happen. And so to impact it using the problem analysis triangle. And there's another aspect of this that's very important for our understanding, and that is prevention. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of different types of prevention now. And in the next webinar, the entire webinar is going to be about prevention. So what are those two types? Now, there's programs. As you see here, the police officer is talking to a young class and probably talking about stranger danger, about the danger of the internet and things like that. Those are programs and brochures. And those are very important to crime prevention in a community. In fact, in the crime prevention webinar, I'm going to give you lots and lots of resources for your community where you can log on to NCPC's site and get a calendar that has brochures that are printable for your community, that you could put your community's logo on it and make those crime prevention brochures yours. And then you can put them in every public place and online so people can download them for themselves. So that's programs. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the next class. But I want to tease you a little bit with some of the more interesting and dynamical crime prevention ideas that are being used by police and communities that really have an impact on crime and fear of crime. One is crime prevention through environmental design, and the other is situational crime prevention. So what are these things? Well, crime prevention from environmental design, as you can see in this drawing illustration, which I love to use because it's not what we want, with high walls and police and helicopters and everything else. That's not what it is all about. What CPTED says is that, look, how you design and use the environment can lead to a reduction in fear and the incidence of crime, an improvement of quality of life. Well, what's that mean? Well, it means quite simply, and I'll give you one very, very simple example. It means that if you have a community with a lot of vegetation and homes with a lot of vegetation and trees and a downtown with a lot of trees in that, is that if you trim your trees to a 10 to 15 foot canopy, meaning that high up that way, you can see underneath the trees. And so you could see a business, you could see a house. If you improve the lighting so that now you can see and it removes the shadows in that, it will, just by doing that with vegetation, by removing the high bushes from in front of business windows and home windows, will reduce certain types of crimes significantly. It means that if you were building homes in a community, in a group in a community, and you face those homes facing each other in a court, in lots of courts, so that people can see each other, that's a natural way that people can see each other, what they're doing, their neighbors. If you put porches on houses, it means that people are in the front of the house instead of hiding in the backs of their homes. If you have no fences in the back so that people can see each other, that is crime prevention in nature. So it's about environmental design, simple things that you can do to make people safer. So what are the three primary ideas about crime prevention, CPTED as it's called, that we'll talk about in next week's webinar, that's important in the response and the analysis stage of CPTED, of SARA? Well, there's access control. You can do a better job of locking your windows and your doors very cheaply. By raising the canopy and reducing the vegetation, there's a thing called natural surveillance. Well, what's that? It means that it's that delivery people, that your neighbors can see what's going on better at your house, in your backyards, so that if somebody is prowling in your area, and you get to know your neighbors, that they're more likely to be a good neighbor, and call and report it or notify you. Well, what's territorial reinforcement? Well, for the simple things, it could be a gate or it could be a fence in front of your house. But here's a very interesting thing that we learned from research. A house that has a very simple vegetation around the front lawn will be less likely to be burglarized than a house that doesn't have any. Well, what do you mean? Are you telling me, Ron, that if I put simply a little garden that people can step over with rocks and low shrubbery around a house, that people are less likely to commit burglaries? Yes, they are. unless these people know that you have something and they're motivated to take it. But most burglars aren't. Most burglars they go to the back of your house and they get entry to the back of your house and they take things that they see at random. But with these very simple ideas about territorial reinforcement, we know that in the minds of the offenders, it means that you are more concerned about your house's protection. It means you may have other protections in effect, like an alarm and other things. So that's how that works. Well, so what is crime prevention through environmental design? I mean, situational crime prevention. Well, situational crime prevention just talks about the majority of crime that police and communities deal with, opportunity crime. Offenders aren't very smart, folks. Offenders do things based on quick decisions and opportunity. Most offenders, so how do you reduce that part of opportunity crime? By reducing opportunities and increasing risks. Well, what does this mean? Well, as you can see here in this chair, this is at universities. At universities, a lot of students get their bags stolen and their purses stolen. Many universities now have these chairs that you can put your bags so that they hang right between your legs, basically, while you're sitting there in class. And two things occur. One is that people have a hard time taking it off the back of your chair. Number two, when you get up, you bump against it and you're less likely to forget it, right? So that's really helpful. You also see these things in bars, where many times bars now have those little hooks at bar tables where people can put their purses or put their knapsacks. You see them now in shopping centers, where people pushing their shopping carts can hang their bag on a hook that goes right between their arms, instead of in the shopping cart where you're more likely to leave it and it's taken, or they've got a way where the clip goes over where it's harder to take off. Is people walking by just taking your bag out of it. So that's what this is called. And it deals with a lot of different things that we're going to talk about in the next class that helps us to understand these ideas of reducing risks, increasing risks, making it harder, reducing rewards, provocations, and excuses. So I think you'll find the next webinar very helpful as a follow-up. There's another idea about prevention too that I think is most important to note, and that is that what it gets to is that we can do more, communities can do more with prevention and reducing crime than they can with enforcement and reducing crime. That it is tribal courts that help, and specialty tribal courts, such as drug courts, juvenile courts, that help to take alternative ways of dealing with a problem outside of arrest. It is it is freedom schools. As you see in the photo here in Minnesota, a first of its kind, in getting students together to deal with issues in a way that helps them to be less prone or more engaged to a delinquency. It is about sharing the responsibilities of people community-wide. And you see this in a number of different ways. Dancing Against Trauma in Wind River, where the community passionately gets together, and public agencies in the public and the private sector and the general community gets together to share these responsibilities. And not only to share them, but to celebrate their successes. This is a method of sharing responsibilities that I've given to you in this class to help you to understand more of what we're talking about. So let's look at this for a few minutes and look at what you see is a number of methods can be used. Bringing civil action. Well, in housing, we see that a lot. That when housing has a difficult time getting people out of communities, out of housing, because the laws are not clear, that sometimes changing the laws or changing the legislation or taking civil action is one way in which to deal with things better. Another way is changing fees. Sometimes communities find that, we don't charge enough fees for services and it's costing us a lot of money. In other cases, that's not possible. Maybe in some cases it's withdrawing police services. I remember that when I first took over training, in crime prevention, I found out that the police department had not engaged the community and citizen volunteers in crime prevention. So their crime prevention efforts were very narrow. And I said, we've got a rich number of senior volunteers in our community that turned into 150 volunteers that hand out community policing brochures, that do talks in schools, that help to expand the police presence and the number of community policing brochures, and sharing those ideas that are helpful. It also helped to educate the public about crime prevention in a number of different ways. And we found that the senior volunteers had a lot of different skills. They were able to do web pages for some of our different public organizations, for the police department to start putting crime prevention information on their web pages, to open up the web pages to tweeting, to all the different social media mechanisms to get the word out for what's happening in the community and things of that nature. So this is a great model to look at on ways in which a community can share their responsibilities and to basically expand their presence. So what's another way is to take action, carry a commitment to implement a new strategy. So here you say juveniles in a program called Building Sustainable Community Youth and Youth Organizations in Indian Country. So let me ask this question, because I've talked way too much right now. Tell me, because I'd love to hear the examples of youth. What are some of the issues, what are some of the ways in which youth have stepped up in your communities and helped you to respond to community problems? Can some of you share those examples? Big Brother, Big Sister. Great, Teresa. What a great organization. It's very big in my community, as is the Boys and Girls Club. All my children played hoops at the Boys and Girls Club and enjoyed and made a lot of new friends. Great, great programs. What other types of youth-based efforts do you see in crime prevention and in communities that's helpful? Yes, I love it. Thanks, Michelle. Restorative justice. So for those of you that don't know, restorative justice with adults and with youth, as Michelle says, it's restorative justice is a way of dealing with problems, especially mediating problems outside of arrest, or can be used in arrest. And that means that those people who have victimized an individual or a community give back. They recognize that they have wronged a community and they give back. So maybe they've vandalized a school. Well, they're going to give back in a couple of ways. As an adult, they're probably going to end up paying back for the damages as well as doing community services. For a juvenile, they may be just doing community services back. And that's better than the old days of juvenile court, where in my community, they would say, write a paper about why you did this and why you shouldn't do this. And nobody would see that. And they didn't ever have to say, I'm sorry, I'm responsible, except that they wrote about it. And that's not enough. So they find that through restorative justice, they actually have to be engaged and be right up front as to fixing their wrongs. And it's very helpful. Teen court is another way. And that's where restorative justice oftentimes plays a part with juveniles. And Michelle's saying, we deal with the underlying conditions and make recommendations. Perfect. Exactly what we were saying in problem solving in the analysis, to look at the poverty, to look at the addictions, to look at the loss of culture, which in Indian country is a powerful prevention tool that most other communities do not have, are not capable of delivering, because they are so discontiguous. They're so spread out and different that it's not possible. So, or not interested other than from a cultural perspective. From other perspectives, yes, you can play on people's want to keep communities safe, your property safe, your children safe, and things like that. Very good, everybody. And thank you, Rachel. Rachel says she's been involved in restorative justice that give too much influence over the delinquency system in some cases, and may end up being more harmful. So that's good as well. I mean, if it doesn't meet the outcomes of being good for everybody, then there's a problem. So what's the last part of SARA that we look at? Rigorously evaluating the effects. Well, that's kind of scary. Most of us haven't been trained as evaluators, haven't been trained, and is it necessary that everything that we do is based on statistics and data and all that crazy stuff that only professors like me really like and get excited about? Or for neighborhood problems that's not going to be published, what do we really need? Well, a combination of things. We can show that the problem's been eliminated with statistics, with general statistics that are available for existence. Maybe the reduction of arrests for marijuana sales, the number of arrests for meth. Maybe how much meth is in the community. Another way of looking at it, and Joe Lee would tell you this, him and I did a lot of the meth training too, is to look at the price of meth, the price of drugs. When it goes up, it means oftentimes that there's less of it. Well, is there less of it because the cartels are making less? Probably not. And so the drug trafficking organizations are offering less to your community? Probably not. It's probably because somebody's doing a good job of reducing the availability. You could reduce incidents, you could reduce harms, you could shift the responsibility. These are all ways that you can evaluate success. But what do I mean specifically? Here you see kids saying, get drugs off the res. And so how can you do that we need to do? It can be done in a couple different ways. Reporting results to benefit other police agencies. You can look at what other people are doing and use their model for evaluating success, as you see here in a sexual assault effort. You can also look simply at what are the qualitative ways to look at something. Well, let's go back to the problem-solving thing that we had with graffiti. If police say that they track, or a community group says that they track graffiti, and they've learned that they've reduced graffiti in a significant way, and so there's been less complaints about graffitiing. What does that mean? Well, we know from research that means that it's reduced fear. We can say, based on research, we know that that's reduced fear. Well, what if somebody wants to challenge you and say, I don't think it has reduced fear? Well, how can you find that out? Well, you could do a simple survey of your community. You could ask community members that have participated in your reduction of graffiti campaign. You can ask educators to talk to parents and ask, is that true? Is that what we're finding out? So the qualitative methods are important. And let me give you a great example. Years ago, I was teaching a conference on problem solving, and there was a young police officer in New York City that had a park in the middle of high-rise apartment complexes. And in his park, the biggest problem that he had to deal with was gangs. Gangs took over the park, so parents didn't use the park. People were afraid to go through the park. And he used his SARA problem-solving method with community members that wanted to take back the park, with city organizations that wanted to take back the park. And they did a number of different innovative things. Everything from turning on the water in the park at night so that they get sprayed on and gang members didn't want to stay there, to removing the graffiti, to talking to the gang members, to getting the gang units in there to make arrests for the gang members that didn't want to cooperate. And they had a significant reduction of gang appearance in the parks. And when the officer was asked by somebody who challenged him at this conference, and says, well, how do you really know that it mattered? I mean, what was the data that you used? The officer says, I'm a police officer. I don't know about data. We didn't have data. But I can tell you that there were more baby carriages in the parks every day, that the moms are now using the parks. The business people are coming and using parks for lunch. They're sitting on the park benches. The kids are using the parks and the swing sets and that they never used before. And the residents are very happy from my meetings with them. So the lesson here is that you don't need to have only data and statistics. It's good to have if you have it, but it's not always necessary. There will always be critics saying, you need the data, you need the data. From a neighborhood perspective, that's not all that matters. The qualitative things matter as much, if not more, in the minds of people. And so you just got to get the people to beat that drum, so to speak. And you need to celebrate. You need to let your community know the good things that you've done. Now, one more thing I want to talk about before I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy. We've talked about problem solving. There is a body of information that is free for you about 72 different community type problems. Each one of the problems that you mentioned, from car theft to domestic violence to drug endangered children, are contained in what these are called problem-solving guides, and they are all free for you. You can get hard copies of them sent to you, or the entire 72, or you can get them online and look at them. Now, why would you want to? Well, let's say that, go back to graffiti. Let's say that one of the biggest problems your community has is graffiti, and it has decided it wants to put together a task force or a coalition of people to deal with the graffiti problem. And at your first meetings, you started working through scanning and you decided, yes, this is a problem we need to work on. Let's start doing analysis. Well, there's a great problem-solving tips guide that walks you through the SARA process, and there's a guide on graffiti. And that graffiti guide uses the SARA process and can be used as a guide for your group to begin with scanning, to say, ask these questions, do these things, and to finish and come to the point that, yes, we want to move to analysis. And then in the analysis of that guide, it tells you, ask these questions of yourself, try and get this information, and you will not only understand your problem better, but you will identify the underlying problems of graffiti in your community. Then it will ask you questions on analysis, I mean on responses, and provide you what works best for communities based on experience with graffiti. And it will tell you how to look at the qualitative and quantitative ways to analyze graffiti. So this is probably the best resource that I can give to you for problem solving, and it's free. And so you just click on that popcenter.org.problems and you'll see them all there, and you can find a form that you could fill out and get every one. And we are about 5 minutes out, folks. So I want to tell you, thank you very much for your time. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope that that your communities find the information of assistance when you take on these problems in your communities. And let me ask Cindy to go through the next slide, and then if we have a few minutes, I can take any questions. And if not, if you have questions, please send them in. Cindy will send them to me, and I will respond as well after. So Cindy, I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about tribal TTA.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, I will try to be quick. So on your screen right now is our tribal-tta.indiancountrytraining.net. This site is where you'll find additional free resources, additional free online training, and we encourage you to click on this site and also share it. And if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email, and Ron or one of our members of our team will get back to you. Let me see here. To conclude, we will email all of you with our link to view the video presentation of this webinar. Please be sure to complete the survey that you will be directed to immediately following the end of the broadcast. If we have a technical glitch with that survey, I will be sending it out along with the webinar recording. And again, we encourage you to please share it with your staff members and your community. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I'll turn it back over to Ron for the remaining 5 minutes for any questions that you might have. The chat bar is still open, so feel free to pop those questions in there. At 10:30 promptly, I will end the webinar.